I saw this tweet from Jackie Codes recently, and I wanted to react to think about why it looks like there's no intermediate or advanced tutorials out there, especially in game development. I think it's interesting to reflect on that, and most importantly, what can we do about it? First, why does it look like there's no advanced tutorial out there, and is it true? I think it is, and there are many reasons for it. The first one is probably economical. There's always an influx of beginners, especially in a field like game dev, which is constantly becoming easier. We're seeing it even more with Godot as its popularity is growing a lot. This means you always have fresh eyes to look at your content. This in turn can make it economically viable. You can make some money with the videos, you can take it further and create courses or paid tools aimed at beginners. The next reason is that beginners' content is easy to make, or at least it feels like it. Technically, you don't need to be incredibly skilled at something to teach beginner content. Often, we see people just sharing their solution after struggling to figure out a problem. With the experience I have, I feel confident I could teach whatever problem at a beginner level. Of course, if I'm not familiar with it, I'd have to figure out first, but it's probably doable. This, combined with the previous reason, creates a strong incentive for people to just churn out beginner content. There's a misconception here though. It's not because the subject is not complex that it becomes easy to teach. Many tutorials will teach in a bad way, not explaining why they're doing things, not trying to empower their students, but just serve them the information. This can easily lead people to get stuck in tutorial hell. I made a video about that subject if you're interested. When teaching to beginners, you have a bigger responsibility, in my opinion. You're probably familiar with bad teachers making you hate a subject at school, for example. So you see it's not that simple. I think beginner stuff can be more difficult to approach in some ways. That's why I made a course about game juice and not a real beginner make your own game course. It was way harder to teach people about game dev assuming they know practically nothing, especially about coding. This means you have to explain the core concepts of programming, and that can be difficult. My course about juice targets people that are already a bit familiar with Godot and programming, and they want to up their game. See what I did there in terms of game juice. Let me know what you think about teaching to beginners in the comments. Is it harder or easier in your opinion? By definition, beginners don't know yet, thus they are easier to teach to. As they don't have habits, they're less opinionated on how to do things, how to code, clean or not, etc. Once you're more advanced, you have your own way of doing things. You have opinions on software, techniques, coding styles, etc. You become way more picky about the information and how it's delivered. You also have more knowledge, so you might ask harder questions. Apart from these explanations, some tutorials are created out of necessity, in a way. If you struggled with something, you might be tempted to document it to help other people. This is especially true for newer tools where resources tend to be sparse. Again, this statistically happens a lot more with beginners, and it's usually easier to help others because your problems are not yet super complex. Speaking of complexity, more advanced topics often require game-specific solutions. It's harder to teach some of these in a generic, engine-agnostic way. It's possible, and there are things out there, we'll come back to it, but it's harder. And because it's harder, it often leads to less people being inclined to make content about it. You're going to reach less people, which is going to generate less revenue, and you'll probably need to spend more time making sure the information is correct, thorough, and high quality. Because it's like targeting a niche, the content is often paid, usually behind video courses, seminars, or books. Free tutorials would not reach enough people to be interesting financially, and if it's your job, it makes sense to make paid content for more advanced topics. And with more complex topics, you also often require certifications. I don't know if it's the case in the game dev specifically, but in IT, for example, you might want to have an Azure or AWS certification to be more employable. This becomes critical if what you're doing is a security risk. I think you wouldn't want a doctor to be self-taught, but it's less of a problem for a 2D artist, for example. The last point, I think, is that people start to self-teach a lot more after a certain level. Of course, it depends a lot on who you are and how you learn, but I think when you have enough basics, you can kind of tackle new problems and figure out stuff on your own. This might even be a necessity if you work with your own tech or if you want a game-specific approach. I personally learned a lot on my own by simply experimenting, looking at the documentation or directly at code. I watched a few tutorials when I got started, and quickly I just tried to experiment things myself. It's been a while since I've watched a tutorial, and I feel like I don't really need it. Unless I want to kickstart my learning, of course, or if I don't want to spend the time figuring out the solution myself, which honestly is quite rare. I think it's just a bad idea to write stuff you don't understand. Okay, all of that is interesting, I hope, but what to do about it? What if you're trying to do something or learn a subject and you don't have a good tutorial for it? I don't pretend I have all the answers. I'm going to suggest a few approaches, so don't hesitate to comment with your ideas and solutions. Looking outside of game dev is a first good idea. There are a lot more people out there doing math, physics, arts, etc. You don't have to learn vector math specifically for game dev. The concept is the same in math and physics. Because these subjects are more widely used, you'll probably find more tutorials or free courses. Same thing is true for programming, of course. You can find programming-specific learning resources and then apply them to your game. I talked about it before. Courses, especially paid ones, might be a good resource for learning advanced topics. When I say courses, I mean it as a general concept. It can be workshops, private tutoring, books, whatever. What I mean is paying someone for their expertise and mostly their capacity to teach and empower you. I think this is incredibly important to learn, to kind of vibe with the teacher in a way. The more advanced information is out there, and sometimes it's just harder to reach because you don't have someone digesting it for you on a YouTube video. This means you have to search for it in a research paper, for example, or even in open source code. Research papers can be interesting for advanced rendering techniques, algorithms, etc. They don't have to be new, of course, but it can help if you want to do things that are not yet popularized by libraries or game engines, for example. The field of AI moves very fast, so it would be a great place to start looking for new algorithms, for example. There are also conferences where very high-skilled people talk about their approach. One of them is GDC, and you can find free talks online. Of course, you also have specialized forums that can help. While the Godot forum can be nice, not everyone there will be advanced in math, for example. So you can always go to forums like Stack Overflow for code or Math Exchange for, well, math. There are probably lots of other forums like these for your specific needs. Don't hesitate to comment down below with some of your favorite. Open source code can also be a great example, especially since some of the projects are quite massive and innovative. I'm thinking about Godot for sure, and maybe even Blender. It can be interesting for you to see how they're coding certain features, or even just how they organize and structure their code and files. Godot, for example, is a C++ engine that is quite easy to understand in my opinion, as they use a very simple form of C++ that is not template hell. This makes it a good place to start working with and learning C++. Even pros do it, as we've found some traces of Godot's lightmap implementation in the source engine from Valve. It doesn't have to be new though. Some old games have been open sourced and they can be a great source of inspiration for optimization, for example, as games were made to run on much tighter constraints. The famous fast inverse square root algorithm was found in the Quake source code, for example. I'll let you read about that more if you're interested, link down below. And I think that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments what are your thoughts. Thanks to the supporters on Patreon for helping me make this video. If you want to support me, head over to patreon.com/MrElliptic. And if you'd like to check out my course about game juice on Udemy or Itch, the link is in the description. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.